My parents helped my brother buy a house and told me to just rent. Those were the last words my father said before sliding a thick envelope across the dining table, an envelope stuffed with paperwork, bank drafts, and a future that had never been meant for me. My brother grinned as he signed page after page. My mother wiped away happy tears. They talked about family legacy, grandchildren, Sunday barbecues in the backyard. I sat 3 feet away, holding a coffee mug that had already gone cold. Then my mother turned toward me with a smile that somehow hurt more than anger. "You don't need to rush," she said softly. "Rent for a few years. Your time will come." My time. As if fairness had a waiting list. Outside, I watched my brother pose beside the sold sign, keys sparkling in his hand while cameras clicked. Every flash felt like another reminder that I wasn't overlooked by accident. I had simply never been part of the plan. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and new paint from the empty house behind him. Laughter drifted through the neighborhood, while my chest tightened. With a silence too heavy for words, I looked down at my own envelope. Inside wasn't a down payment. It was a brochure for nearby apartments my parents had printed for me. My father had even circled the cheapest one in blue ink. "Starting small builds character," he'd said before patting my shoulder like he was doing me a favor. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why my brother's dreams deserved investment while mine deserved advice. That was the moment everyone expected me to become bitter. Instead, I became invisible. Because the quietest people in the room are often the ones making the longest plans. I folded the apartment brochure, slipped it into my pocket, congratulated my brother, hugged my parents, and walked away wearing the same polite smile they'd mistaken for acceptance. They thought they had decided my future. They had no idea they had just introduced me to it. I wasn't the family disappointment. That would have been easier to understand. I was something far more forgettable. The reliable child who never demanded attention, because I learned early that attention always came with conditions. My older brother filled every room with confidence. He spoke first, laughed loudest, and expected the world to rearrange itself around him. My parents called it leadership. I called it gravity. Everything seemed to orbit him, including their hopes, their money, and their excuses. I became the opposite without realizing it. I worked quietly, saved consistently, and solved my own problems before anyone noticed they existed. Every achievement I reached was met with a polite smile and a quick change of subject. If my brother landed an average promotion, we celebrated over dinner. When I earned a raise after years of late nights, my father simply asked whether I was still thinking about renting. At first, I believed fairness would arrive naturally. I thought if I stayed patient, worked harder, and proved myself enough times, someone would eventually notice the imbalance. Instead, I discovered that people grow comfortable benefiting from your silence. So I stopped waiting for recognition. I built routines instead of expectations. I tracked every dollar I earned, every unnecessary expense I avoided, and every skill that made me more valuable at work. While friends upgraded cars to impress strangers, I drove the same dependable sedan because it started every morning and owed me nothing. While my brother furnished rooms with money he hadn't earned, I invested in knowledge no one could take away. The strange thing about being underestimated is that people stop watching you. They assume they already know how your story ends. My parents believed they had measured my potential years earlier. My brother never bothered asking what I was working toward because he assumed there wasn't much to ask. They saw a renter. I saw someone with complete freedom to write a different ending. One quiet decision at a time. The insults were never loud enough for anyone else to call them insults. That was what made them so effective. Whenever the family gathered, my brother's mortgage became everyone's favorite conversation. My father would ask about renovations with genuine curiosity, studying photos on his phone as if he were admiring a masterpiece he had helped create. Then, almost as an afterthought, he'd glance at me. "Still in that apartment?" Not, "How are you?" Just the apartment. I would nod, and the conversation would drift away before I could answer with anything more than a single word. At birthdays, my mother introduced me to relatives by mentioning my stable job. She introduced my brother as a homeowner. The pause between those two descriptions said everything she never admitted aloud. One Christmas, my brother laughed as he handed me a decorative keychain shaped like a tiny house, so you'll have something ready when you finally get one. Everyone chuckled. My mother lightly tapped his arm, telling him to behave. But she was smiling as she said it. No one noticed that. I slipped the keychain into my pocket instead of placing it on the table. I never defended myself. Not because I agreed with them, but because explanations are expensive. Silence costs nothing. Each comment, each sideways glance, each polite dismissal became another quiet deposit into a private account only. I could see they mistook my calm for surrender. What they never realized was that while they were measuring my life by the address on my driver's license, I had already started measuring it by the deeds locked inside, a small fireproof safe they had never seen. The decision didn't happen after a fight. It happened after a phone call. My father rang one Saturday morning to ask if I could help my brother move into a larger place. He spoke as though my weekend already belonged to the family. By the end of the conversation, he casually mentioned they were lending my brother more money for the upgrade. Then he laughed. Good thing you don't have a house to worry about. The line went quiet. For the first time, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I looked around my apartment, the same modest place they loved to pity. On the kitchen counter sat my savings spreadsheet. Next to it was a notebook filled with neighborhoods, property prices, rental demand, and years of careful calculations. I hadn't been standing still. I'd been preparing. Something inside me settled. I realized I had spent too many years hoping my family would eventually choose me, when the only person responsible for changing my future was already staring back from the dark reflection in the window. That Monday, I met with a lender. I wasn't shopping for a dream home or trying to impress anyone. I was buying an opportunity I could afford, one that made sense on paper even if it looked ordinary from the street. 3 months later, I signed the closing documents. No announcement. No celebration. No family photos. I carried the keys home alone, unlocked the front door, and stood inside an empty living room where every wall echoed with something I had never felt before. Not victory, freedom. That was the day I stopped chasing their approval and quietly started building a future they wouldn't even notice until it was far too late. Owning one property didn't change my life overnight. It changed the way I thought. Instead of treating my first home as the finish line, I treated it as my education. Every evening after work, I read books on real estate investing, financing, taxes, and property management. I attended free seminars at local community centers, listened to experienced investors, describe both their successes and expensive mistakes, and learned enough to separate good opportunities from emotional purchases. I built spreadsheets that compared neighborhoods, estimated maintenance costs, tracked interest rates, and projected rental income years into the future. Every number had to make sense before I signed anything. I refused to buy because something looked impressive. I only bought when the math agreed with me. When I had enough equity and savings, I purchased a small rental property in an older neighborhood that most people overlooked. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. A reliable tenant moved in within weeks, and every monthly payment quietly strengthened the foundation for the next investment. I never mentioned any of it at family dinners. If someone asked how work was going, I answered with a simple, busy. That was enough. People rarely ask follow-up questions when they think they've already figured you out. Years passed that way, one careful decision leading to another. My raises increased my savings. My tenants helped pay down mortgages. I reinvested instead of upgrading my lifestyle. While my brother talked about the size of his backyard, I focused on balance sheets, reserves, and long-term stability. The greatest advantage I ever had wasn't money. It was that no one in my family believed I was building anything worth noticing. By the time they finally looked in my direction again, the quiet renter they remembered no longer existed. The moment arrived years later, without warning. My parents hosted another family barbecue, the kind where conversations drifted between mortgage rates, rising home values, and plans for retirement. I stood by the grill, listening more than speaking, just as I always had. My brother walked over carrying 2 drinks and leaned against the fence. "So," he said with an easy smile, "how's your house?" It wasn't a cruel question. It was worse. It was the kind of question someone asks when they're certain they already know the answer. I looked at him for a second, noticing the faint lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Time had moved on for both of us. Then I smiled. "Which one?" He laughed, expecting a joke. I didn't. The silence stretched between us. "What do you mean? Which one?" I answered quietly, almost casually. "The townhouse I started with. The rental across town? Or the duplex I bought last year?" His smile disappeared before he could hide it. Across the yard, my parents had stopped talking. My mother lowered the serving spoon she was holding. My father stared at me as if he had misheard. I wasn't boasting. I wasn't angry. I simply answered the question they had asked. For the first time in my life, nobody interrupted me. Nobody changed the subject. The only sound was the soft hiss of the grill and the wind moving through the trees. Years of assumptions collapsed in a few calm sentences. I hadn't won because they lost. I had won because I had quietly built a life that no longer needed their permission, their money, or their approval. No one argued with me that afternoon. There was nothing to argue about. The facts had arrived quietly, and facts don't raise their voices. My brother looked away first, staring into his drink as if the answer might be floating somewhere near the ice. For years, he had assumed we were running the same race, except he believed he was permanently ahead. Now he was trying to remember when I had disappeared from his rearview mirror. My mother was the first to speak. "Why didn't you tell us?" I almost smiled. Because no one had asked. Not really. They had asked about my apartment, my job, my plans to eventually buy a home. But no one had ever asked what I was actually building. They had confused silence with stagnation. My father nodded slowly, the confidence that had always colored his opinions replaced by something unfamiliar: regret. Not because I had become successful, but because he realized he had never bothered to look closely enough to see it happening. Something changed after that day. Family conversations became more careful. Advice turned into questions. The quiet son they had underestimated was suddenly someone they wanted to understand. But the greatest change happened inside me. I no longer measured my worth against what my family chose to give, celebrate or ignore. Their approval had once felt like the prize. Now I understood it had only ever been a distraction. People often believe revenge is about making someone else feel small. It isn't. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is living so well, so deliberately, and so independently, that the people who underestimated you are forced to confront the story they wrote about you and realize they were wrong all along. Life didn't become perfect after that afternoon. My parents couldn't rewrite the years they had spent investing more faith in one child than the other. My brother couldn't pretend our conversation had never happened. Some wounds leave scars even after they've healed. But something unexpected replaced the resentment I had carried for so long. Peace. Not because my family finally saw my worth, but because I no longer needed them to. The properties continued to grow in value. Some tenants moved on, others stayed for years. I bought carefully, sold rarely, and kept living below my means. Success stopped feeling like a destination and became a habit built from thousands of ordinary decisions that no one else ever noticed. Our family gatherings changed in subtle ways. My father asked for my opinion before offering his own. My mother stopped comparing my life to anyone else's. My brother and I even found a quieter respect for one another, not because we had become identical, but because the competition existed only in his mind, never in mine. Looking back, I realized the apartment brochure my parents once handed me was never a sentence. It was an invitation, not to rent forever, to stop expecting doors to open for me and learn how to build my own. The greatest revenge wasn't owning more houses than my brother. It was becoming the kind of person who could have lost every property tomorrow and still known exactly how to build everything again. Because in the end, wealth can be taken, approval can disappear, but the discipline, patience, and quiet confidence you earn while everyone else is looking the other way. That is the one home no one can ever take from you.